The Florida Maquis has largely tried to stay away from the arguments in the mainstream media about the previous election, about Russia this, Russia that, Russia the other. Primarily because everybody else was talking about it. And everybody had their own opinion on it. And I wasn't going to jump into that fray. There were other things going on in the world that were more important, at least to my mind. One thing that neither side has bothered to ask is this question, especially the left. If it was something where there was some type of desire on the part of Russia to have one candidate over another, why? What would be the reason? See, Americans are fairly narcissistic that they think the world revolves around who our leader is and what their particular leanings are, one way or the other. I mean, we lurch from one side to the other every 8 years. Why would it have been so critical for them to go to these lengths to influence the election in a way that it just, unless you can find the reason why, every other argument about their involvement falls flat. You'd have to have some type of a huge motivating factor. Well, in today's video, I think I might have found a piece of that puzzle. And it wasn't something I was looking for. It was something I was doing an entirely different video about an entirely different subject, and a name came up that starts to put pieces together. One of the things that struck me as odd about the current administration was this story, and I've used it as a bellwether. The story of course, Venezuela. Why is the left, CNN, and the right, why are they in virtual lockstep as far as the story goes? Try to find one article on CNN, if you think they're a bunch of leftists, that would defend Venezuela, Maduro, or Chavez, or anything like that. They don't. There's just not out there. They're right on board with the sanctions as much as, and it was Barack Obama that started the sanctions back in 2015. It just seemed incredibly odd that of all of the things that the current administration holds up and says this was wrong with the last administration, in this particular topic, they are right with them, right alongside of them, and that is a giant warning bell. Well, anyway, with no further ado, we've seen in the last year Venezuela make inroads with Russia, make inroads with China. And one of the big pushbacks that I've gotten, and this is what the video was going to be about, was this issue of the expropriation of the assets. Now, what a lot of people don't understand about this award to Conoco, people in Venezuela were actually celebrating this. Why? Because the original lawsuit was for $22 billion. See, what this court was saying when they awarded $2 billion was that Conoco had overstated its losses by 90%. And that's what a lot of people do not get. This was a huge slap in the face to Conoco, this measly little $2 billion award. There was protocol in place in the agreement with Venezuela, PDVSA, and Conoco, that if the government of Venezuela believed that Conoco hadn't lived up to its promises or lived up to its end of the contract, it could, in fact, take advantage of a clause in the agreement and expropriate those assets. This is why it wasn't a criminal act. It wasn't, Conoco didn't charge that any criminal act had occurred. It was a civil violation. They said that, we believe that we did live up to our end, and them enforcing this part of the agreement was inappropriate. That's why they went to the courts. And when the courts looked at everything, they said, oh, okay, well, I guess, yeah, technically you can say that you did, but only to the extent that here's about 7% of your loss. And this is something that never gets reported, at least not in those terms. And you can find this here. I'll link this for you. This reports that. And it's a hard thing to find because they bury it. It says right here, Conoco had sought up to $22 billion from PDVSA for the broken contracts, quote unquote, and loss of future profits. And this is a whole nother argument that I probably need to do a video on, the difference between revenue and profits. And this is what's been going on in Venezuela for a long time. Because it used to be total revenue was split. It's like 50-50. You know, we're going to get half, you're going to get half, make your end work or don't, one way or the other. But when you say it's profits, you leave it up to the business to determine what the profits are. And they can monkey with numbers all day long and say, we didn't earn any profits, even though they're putting money in all sorts of different places that they say is necessary. But it's very strange. I found this article from Reuters, and it was from a year ago. And I did some highlighting in it about Russia's role in all of this. Now, strangely enough, they ask a question here that they never answer in this article about why, when all of this was going on with Venezuela and Venezuela was defaulting and they were expropriating assets, why would Russia put all of this money into Venezuela when the idea was that they might not ever be paid back? If the idea truly was that, you know, this was a failed state and it was collapsing and it had no chance of recovery, why would Russia dump money into a black hole like that? And why would China as well? Well, down here in this article, it reveals it. Now, this article, just real quick, is 11 August 2017, so this is over a year ago. This was when there were the street protests and everybody said that it was imminent that Maduro was going to resign and all this stuff. And we see that that's all largely gone. Sorry about that. There we go. Now, it says here, Venezuela state-owned firm PDVSA has been secretly negotiating since at least early this year with Russia's biggest state-owned oil company, Rosneft, offering ownership interest in up to 9 of Venezuela's most productive petroleum projects. Now, I guess you would have to look at Basic Business 101 on this and say, if someone must have said either to this administration or the last administration, you know, if we continue these sanctions, they're going to turn to Russia, they're going to turn to China. Somebody, if we destroy these folks and we drive the value of everything there down into the basement, like any good investor, other places are going to come in and swoop it up because oil is oil is oil. Whether it's traded in petrodollars or whether it's traded in anything else, it has its same inherent value, and someone was going to come in, make the investment. And it might be people that we don't like on our southern border, so maybe the sanctions aren't such a fantastic idea for the long-term security and well-being of the United States. And here it says Rosneft delivered, sorry about this, Venezuela's state-owned firm more than $1 billion in April, that was 2017, alone in exchange for a promise of oil shipments later. A promise. Just a promise. And here's the thing that a lot of people do not get. Rosneft has positioned itself as a middleman in sales of Venezuelan oil, meaning they're buying up their oil dirt cheap or taking it as repayments for the loans. And much of it ends up at refineries in the United States, despite U.S. sanctions against Russia. So the oil was still coming to us. It was just coming to us with a middleman now. Isn't that an interesting turn of events? That because of the sanctions, instead of Venezuelan oil coming right from Venezuela, right to U.S. refineries, it then went from there to Russia, who then marked it up and then sold it to our refineries at an increased rate. Kind of convenient, don't you think? Very freaking interesting set of events. Instead of buying the oil directly from Venezuela, now we have to buy it from Russia. And here is the net effect of the sanctions right here. Russia's growing control over Venezuelan crude gives it a stronger foothold in energy markets across the Americas. Rosneft now resells about 225,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil, about 13% of the nation's total exports. That's enough to satisfy the daily demand of a country the size of Peru. This was the net effect of the sanctions. Remember, the sanctions that started in the last administration, strangely enough, right around the exact same time that the U.S. lifted its ban on oil exports. Literally the exact same year, 2014, is when the Congress first started talking about it. And 2015 is when the first executive order came down from Obama. And then as soon as the current administration takes power, they ramp up the sanctions even worse. All basically with the effect of being driving Venezuelan oil into the hands of the Russians and the Chinese. Maduro's administration has grown increasingly dependent on Moscow in the past 2 years, as China has curtailed credit to Venezuela because of payment delays and the corruption and crime faced by Chinese firms operating there. So, the government of Mr. Maduro was arresting people who were in bed with big oil in the region, and China decided to turn the screws and say, okay, we're not going to give you this money if you're going to be arresting our corrupt officials, even further driving the need in Venezuela for Russian intervention. And through all of this, the Russians never thought for 1 minute they were going to be defaulted on, ever. Every time something like this happened, the Russians threw more money into the problem. Why? How did these people know that it was going to be a huge payoff? And how did, more importantly, how did the current administration not see this and not lift the sanctions and make better deals with Venezuela in order to drive that oil out of the hands of the Russians and back into our hands at a lower price? That would be my question, because this is pretty clear to see now. And here's something that I don't think a lot of people would read and understand. In March of last year, the Venezuelan Supreme Court, whose members are loyal to Maduro, took over the powers of the opposition-controlled National Assembly. A majority of elected assembly members opposed any new oil deals with Russia and insisted on retaining power to veto them. Within a matter of days, the protests got so bad that they had to reverse that. Days later, after fierce national protests against the action, the court returned most of the power to the national legislature at Maduro's public urging, meaning that the people of this country rose up in the streets and forced the highest court in their land to relent on a decision. Imagine that. Just think about that, if that would ever happen in this country, where our court would rule something that was completely egregious and out of line, and there would be such an outcry from the people that in a matter of days the court would reverse their ruling. What kind of people does this sound like to you? Do they sound like a bunch of passive babies just waiting for a government check? No, not to me. And here it talks about this super election, or super body election, called the Constituent Assembly, that they called a sham. But clearly here we are 13 months later, and we haven't seen any giant street protests against this constituent election, the Constituent Assembly election. So clearly 13 months later, this was not a sham election. These people that are now running the government are, in essence, a reflection of the people of Venezuela, whether they're socialist or not, one way or the other. But there isn't some tiny little cabal that is running the country when the vast majority of the people in the country don't want him to be in power. It's literally not that at all. And we can see that right here in this article. Because when the courts did something they didn't like, they literally set the place on fire. If this was the case, Maduro would have been killed a long time ago. And this, I think, was part of the deal, is that Venezuela has been driven off of the US dollar and has been now forced, basically, to operate a completely different way, with the Russians and the Chinese having a giant hand in it. Because the food was always there. The assets were always there. It was just a matter of the dollars to purchase them. It was an economic issue, not a supply issue. And this is just more that I have outlined here that speaks about how Russia is a middleman and how they're reaping huge profits from being this middleman with no fear of loss. Rosneft, is this company in Russia, is selling Venezuelan crude to India as a middleman and marking things up. And I'll link this article. You can read it for yourself. How if there was ever a reason, if you could make a reason for those sanctions being continued and ramped up and Venezuela being forced to turn to Russia, this would be a reason. If a person who was running against Mr. Administrator, Mr. Administrator, had made any kind of an indication that those sanctions were going to be maybe revisited and maybe loosened so that we could maintain Venezuela as an ally, I could see that would be a huge motivator for Russia to, influence the election because of the billions, tens of billions of dollars at stake. This is more of an indicator here that this might have been going on for a while. 2006, shunned by the United States, which since 2006 has refused to supply spare parts for Venezuela's fleet of U.S.-built F-16 fighter jets, Venezuela being our ally, Chavez bought Russian Sukhoi fighter jets, helicopters, tanks, and guns from Putin. This clearly states exactly why, when you disagree with somebody's political system and you have them as an ally, it's a very bad idea to make their life financially hard, because there's going to be other people that are going to find ways to make it easy, and the net grander effect will be your life being much worse. And here's the part I was talking about, the name that popped up. Top executives from Rosneft and PDVSA were later involved in negotiations related to the military purchases because Rosneft was the Russian entity receiving the Venezuelan oil cargoes used to pay for a portion of the weapons. They included Rosneft President Igor Sechin, a powerful longtime advisor and deputy to Putin. Sechin is a trained linguist who began his career as a military interpreter and has a passion for the history of Latin America's revolutionaries. Igor Sechin. This isn't a name that I have brought up in any other article about Venezuela. But strangely enough, of course, and I'm sure a lot of you who follow it know where I'm going with this. This is the guy that met with Carter Page. And if it was only for the purpose of saying, make sure the sanctions stay in place, which, by the way, Mr. Trump, in the first 100 days of his administration, got together with his Goldman Sachs banker in charge of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and made sure that was done. Of all of the things that had to be done, and all the things that were on the current administration's plate, this was a first 100 days thing to do. So if you're looking for a reason why on that whole argument, I think we might have found it. They needed someone in the White House that they knew for sure would maintain the status quo with Venezuela and not even bother to negotiate, not even bother to revisit and take what happened with Mr. Obama and add all sorts of stuff to it, driving Venezuela further away from the United States and giving Russia and China a much larger foothold in this hemisphere. So, anyway, just my take on it. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to find it, but you got to follow it where it goes. I know this is a much, much longer video than I normally do, but I just, I was flabbergasted. I mean, I was reading this and I'm like, of course, this makes perfect sense. It's about oil. It's about big money. It's about control. Venezuela, founding member of OPEC. Huge, huge supplier of oil to the world. And look what we've seen since. All of the talk about Venezuela collapsing and all of the talk about how they were just going to fall apart and how it was just an imminent. Never happened. Why? This is why. It was all just an act so that they could shift the money from the United States to Russia and China. We'll leave it there. I'm sure the comment section is going to be great on this one. Like, share, subscribe.